Good evening and welcome to the Bartlett School of Planning's Sir Peter Hall annual lecture for 2020. My name is John Tomney. I'm Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at UCL and I will chair this evening's proceedings. This evening we conclude our public lecture series for 2019-20, which began in October last year. That feels like a very long time ago. In our series this year, we've heard from Carol Williams, Julie Froud of Manchester Business School, Lynn Seglin of Columbia University, John Forrester of Cornell, and Andy Pike of Newcastle University. Tonight's event is our first ever virtual public lecture, so bear with us. We hope to have an opportunity for questions and discussions at the end of the lecture, technology permitting. We aim to conclude by 7:15. It's our normal practice on these occasions to offer hospitality to our speakers and audience. And we're very sad that we cannot do this evening, but we very much look forward to doing so again when the time is right. Tonight's lecture is named for our late and much missed colleague, Professor Sir Peter Hall. Peter's work on cities and regions is known globally and was and continues to be highly influential in the fields of public policy and practice. But at the Bartlett School of Planning, he is remembered also as a mentor, inspiration, and friend. We use this occasion each year both to remember Peter and honour his enormous contribution to academic and public debates, and to invite a leading scholar or practitioner to address themes resonant with his work. So we reserve the Peter Hall lecture for somebody of exceptional achievement in our field. Tonight's speaker fully meets that criterion. The Right Honourable Lord Kerslake is one of the UK's foremost public servants of recent times. Robert Kerslake was born in Somerset and studied at Warwick University, from which he graduated with a first-class degree in mathematics, and where he was also General Secretary of the Students' Union. He went on to hold a number of posts with councils in London before becoming Chief Executive of the London Borough of Hounslow. He then took up the post of Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council in 1997. Between 2008 and 2010, he was Chief Executive of the Homes and Communities Agency, and in September 2010 was appointed Permanent Secretary at the Department for Communities and Local Government. He was head of the Home Civil Service from 2011 until September 2014. Lord Kerslake has received many honours. He was knighted for services to local government in 2005, was appointed to the House of Lords in 2015. Also in 2015, he was elected a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. Lord Kerslake remains a man of many parts and recently has chaired the UK2070 Commission on Regional Inequalities, which UCL supported, the work of which will form the focus of his remarks this evening. So Bob, I would like to extend a warm virtual welcome to UCL. We very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on regional inequalities and how we should tackle them in these extraordinary times. Over to you.
Well, thank you, John, and good evening to everyone. Can I first say how delighted I am to be giving the Sir Peter Hall lecture this year, even in these very extraordinary circumstances. Sir Peter was, of course, one of the most prolific, creative and influential urbanists of the 20th century. He was an advisor on planning and regeneration to successive governments and is credited with developing the idea of enterprise zones, which he originally called free ports. It is somewhat ironic that free ports are now being considered as part of the response to Brexit. I was not fortunate enough to know Sir Peter well personally, but like everyone else interested in planning and urban development, I knew of his extraordinary body of work. Among Sir Peter's many interests were the challenges of urban and regional development in the UK. Indeed, he wrote one of the standard texts on the topic, in which he set out the causes of spatial inequalities and how and why public policy should respond to these. The work of the 2070 Commission, which I want to talk about tonight, in many ways carries forward his concerns into our present era. We are at the moment in the grip of an emergency, a pandemic that has swept the globe, taken many lives, and halted large parts of our economy. It might therefore seem odd for me to be talking about a commission whose whole time frame was consciously long game, looking back 50 years and forward 50 years, albeit with shorter term recommendations. However, for reasons I hope that I will make clear later in my speech, it is highly relevant to how we as a country recover from the effects of this terrible virus. When Vincent Goodstadt and I first spoke about the Commission over 2 years ago now, we were clear in our minds that whatever the Commission did should be underpinned by evidence. In this, we have been very well supported by academics from the 3 founding universities, Sheffield, Manchester and UCL, as well as Cambridge and Liverpool. I'd like to give my particular thanks to John Toomey at UCL for his contribution, and indeed to UCL itself for organising and hosting this lecture. There is a strong emphasis now in higher education research on having impact. I think we can safely say that the work done to support the Commission has met that test. The Commission's first report, published in April of last year, provoked a considerable response. Yet the existence of regional inequalities was hardly new. What was striking about our report, I think, was the comprehensive evidence we set out about the depth and direction of those inequalities and the continuing economic, social and political consequences for this country if we did not tackle that inequality. The comparison work done by Professor Philip McCann at Sheffield University showed that on a basket of 28 indicators, the UK came 28th out of 30 countries in terms of spatial inequalities. The modelling by Dr. Ying Jin at Cambridge showed that on a high growth scenario, over half of the new jobs created in the future would go to London and the wider South East. Now, this might look like good news for the South, but the consequences of the growing imbalance were bad for everyone. In a higher growth scenario, London and the wider South East faced the challenges of increasingly unaffordable housing, longer commuting times, and growing environmental pressures. In a low growth scenario, which is what we may be now about to experience with COVID, some regions even went backwards. In short, everybody loses. What particularly hit home in our first report was the comparison with Germany, which seemed to have made much better progress in closing the economic gap following reunification. Here is just one further statistic from the Commission that captures the scale of the challenge. Jobs growth in London and the wider South East in the last 10 years has been at more than twice the rate of the North. That's 1 million more jobs created. Our final report was published on the 27th of February this year, just before coronavirus took over as the dominant news item. The focus of this report was action. We set out a 10-point plan to reverse the trend and rebalance the UK. Let me summarise these 10 actions. Ensuring an explicit spatial dimension to the plans to get to zero carbon by 2050. Delivering a transformed public transport network between cities, within cities and beyond cities. Creating new networks of research and development excellence to complement the so-called golden triangle of London, Oxford and Cambridge. Strengthening the foundations of our local economies tasking local leaders to produce inclusive growth plans. Recognising housing as a part of national infrastructure and planning now for the housing consequences of levelling up. Harnessing our cultural and environmental assets outside London. Devolving more powers and funding away from Whitehall. Developing a national plan to raise attainment and ensure we have the skills we need for the future. Tripling the Shared Prosperity Fund to 15 billion per annum and ensuring fairer access to funds. And finally, tasking the National Infrastructure Commission to produce a national spatial plan for England. We argued in our final report that to deliver change effectively on this scale would require a change not just in what government does, but how it does it. Our report set out the changes we felt were needed. These included a national outcomes framework to measure progress, strong political leadership, and a powerful cross-government committee to oversee delivery, and a dedicated national team to lead the programme across government. Most important of all, and something that I will return to later in my speech, is devolution of power away from Whitehall. In between the first and the final report, a new Conservative government was elected, pledging to level up the country. We welcomed this pledge, but argued that to be effective, the government needed to have a large-scale, comprehensive and long-term plan to deliver it. Anything less would raise expectations without delivering. In short, the government needed to go big or go home. Now, dealing with the challenges of Brexit and subsequently coronavirus have delayed the government's work on this. But the need for a plan addressing the priorities set out in our final report remains no less essential. There isn't time for me to go through each of the 10 priorities in detail, but I would like to focus on 3 issues in particular: devolution, the importance of effective spatial planning at all levels, and the debate about towns and cities. At the heart of our proposals was the need to devolve power and resources away from Westminster to places and communities. As a former head of the civil service who worked a long time in local government, I can say with absolute confidence that in this country we have an overloaded centre and disempowered communities. It's not a surprise to me that we are both one of the most centralised countries in the OECD and one of the most unequal. Achieving effective devolution means moving on from the patchwork quilt created by the deal-based approach of recent years, which I believe has run its course. We need to replace it with a comprehensive and ambitious programme of devolution covering all areas of the country. Only in this way will we free up local places to deliver the brilliant innovation we know they are capable of, and at the same time release central government to focus on the things that only they can do. Devolution should be taken to the lowest practical level, consistent with the effective delivery of those powers. In the first instance, local government. Beyond that, to mayors and combined authorities. And beyond that, to collaborations at the regional level. It is the last of these, the regional spatial level, that proved the most challenging for the Commission to get to grips with. Previously, we had 9 regions, which were dismantled during the coalition government. In our first report, we leaned towards the idea of creating 4 meta-regions as put forward by the IPPR: North, Midlands, South West and South East. Others have argued for having a larger number of regions, perhaps 14, that would better fit natural geographies. There is no simple answer to this, and no one, including me, wants to get bogged down in drawing lines on a map. However, there are decisions that can only be taken at this larger spatial level. And the alternative, in the absence of this, would be to simply leave them to central government to decide, which I don't think would be a great outcome. Now, some have argued that proposing the government should have a levelling up plan is itself centralist. We should let 100 flowers bloom and see where it leads us. I disagree. For a meaningful devolution to happen, it will require concerted political leadership from the top. Otherwise, the barriers to change are just too great. Equally, even with devolution, some major decisions on national infrastructure, for example, can only be taken by central government. But the process of change needs to be genuinely collaborative, drawing on the voices and experience of mayors and local government leaders. There needs to be a parity of esteem. Whitehall most certainly doesn't always know best. This brings me to the second of my themes, spatial planning. One of the recommendations in our report was that England should have a national spatial plan, as exists in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and indeed much of Western Europe. This would provide a vital context for decisions on infrastructure and development. Our ideas on this are very much in accord with the work of Professor Cecilia Wong in Manchester, one of our commissioners. It also sits well with the findings of Nick Rainsford's report for the TCPA. However, the UK2070 report unpacks these ideas and sets out a potential way forward. A national spatial plan for England should be prepared by a reconstituted National Planning and Infrastructure Commission. It should be linked to the country's priorities and funding regimes, endorsed by Parliament, independently audited in a State of the Nation report, coordinated with the devolved administrations, reviewed in line with parliamentary cycles, and be a material planning consideration. The national plan must be developed from the bottom up and not just imposed top down. The RTPI's own ambitions for the North and the Great North Plan show what is possible. And a companion initiative to the UK2070 Commission, the One Powerhouse Partnership, has developed some indicative regional plans for all of England, which they will be publishing shortly. For me, this national plan should form part of a wider renaissance of spatial planning and urban development. In his final book, Good Cities, Better Lives, How Europe Discovered the Lost Art of Urbanism, Sir Peter Hall looked at our near neighbours in Europe to learn lessons about creating better places to live, work and play. Ironically, it was published in 2014 at a time when local authority planning departments were suffering large cuts, often in the very capacity needed to deliver a creative planning process. It seems to me that at the heart of successful, sustainable European cities lies effective spatial planning and the powers and resources to see those plans through. Now, many of our inherited assumptions about transport, density, the role of town centres and home working will have to be rethought in the light of what we have learned in responding to COVID-19. Professor Mike Batty from UCL has argued this well in his article, The Corona Crisis, What Does the Post-Pandemic City Look Like? But the need for more effective spatial planning at all spatial levels remains as strong as ever. In the UK, much as I am loath to propose yet another change to the planning system, we need a fundamental change in the form of plan we produce to be more quickly produced, more flexible, more forward-looking, and less litigious. Third in my list of issues is the towns v cities debate. Over the last few years, an argument has emerged that our cities have been sorted and we now need to move on to the left-behind towns. I would like to argue passionately that this line of argument is a complete dead end. Firstly, because towns cannot succeed if cities don't succeed. There is indeed an urgent need to invest in our towns, but their economies are rarely strong enough to be self-sustaining. Secondly, whilst there has been good progress in improving the centre of our cities, you do not need to go very far out of the centre of those cities to see large areas of deprivation. In short, the job has not yet been done. It has to be about towns and cities, not towns v cities. And we should focus on the need to strengthen the economic connections between them. In our report, we argue for a connectivity revolution between cities, within cities, and beyond cities to the disconnected towns. The Stockport Mayoral Development Corporation, set up by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, and Stockport Council, which I am chairing, is a good example of what I think is needed. It's also important to recognise that levelling up is not a zero-sum game, which simply involves taking from the south and giving to the north. There are powerful reasons why this should not be the case. Firstly, everyone will benefit from levelling up, including London and the South East. Secondly, we need to grow the pot to increase our spending on infrastructure, research and development skills if we're going to compete economically with other advanced countries. Levelling up needs to be about reducing division, not increasing it. Finally, let me say a bit about how I think the pandemic has affected the levelling up agenda and the work of the 2070 Commission. The need to respond to a health emergency has created an economic emergency and a huge fiscal deficit. We don't know for certain how this will play out in terms of regional disparities, but we do know that it will hit certain businesses, people and places particularly hard. Part of the Commission's future work will focus on understanding these different impacts better. The government will urgently need an economic recovery plan. And indeed, we anticipate an emergency budget in July. Increased unemployment, huge uncertainty, and the fear of a second wave will all impact on investment and spend. At a time when the instincts of the Treasury will be to rein in public spending, there will need to be a large-scale fiscal stimulus package. In a period of enormous anxiety, only the state can act to restore confidence. The key question for me is whether in doing this, the government can lay the foundations for a long-term change, to renew as well as to simply recover, to build back better. Now, it may not be possible to address equally all of the 10 areas for action identified in our report, and in some priorities will have to be agreed for the short and medium term. The UK2070 Commission will be releasing a set of think pieces shortly, which will set out some ideas on the way forward. The debate on how we should build back after the pandemic emergency is only just beginning. To conclude, this annual lecture was started as a response to the need for the planning profession to speak out more loudly on the major issues of the day, to challenge the cynicism and pessimism that too often pervades the debate about the future of society, and to counter the undue influence of those who are less informed and experienced in shaping planning policy and practice. There is no clearer need for this than in the persistent and long-standing fundamental challenges set out in our reports. A failure to start the process of change now would be missing an enormous opportunity. The title of our final UK2070 report was Make No Little Plans. It comes from Daniel Burnham, who took a leading role in the master plans for the development of a number of American cities. I'd like to draw a bit more on his quote. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir the blood and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high. Great ideas will never die, but live long with ever-growing urgency. If now is not the right time for urgency and high ambition, then I'm not sure when it will ever be. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Bob. We now have plenty of time for questions and debate. If you wish to ask a question, make yourself known through the Q&A function at the bottom of your panel. And we will try and include as many contributions as we can. So there's already a question from my colleague, Professor Claire Colomb. She has several questions, I think, that she'd like to put to you. So I'm going to see if we can activate Claire in the, and she can speak directly to Lord Kerslake. Okay, hopefully Claire will appear shortly. There we are, Claire. Unmute your mic.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hi, Claire.
Hello, thank you very much for your insightful lecture and for all the work that you've done with the Commission. I have two questions. One is whether with the Commission you have considered to resurrect the idea of regional elected regional assemblies to address the democratic deficits, specifically in England, when it comes to give a voice to people at the regional level, or whether you took it for granted that after the failed referendum of 2004, this probably is not a good idea. And the second question is more about your point on how to foster collaboration between booming dynamics metropolitan areas in the north and the towns that surround them. So I'm thinking of Manchester, but of course there are plenty of other examples. Have you looked at the model that has been used in other parts of Europe, like France, of a system of metropolitan fiscal equalization, whereby part of the council tax that is levied in the local authorities at the metropolitan area is used to redistribute and organize services at the metropolitan level?
Well, thank you for that, Claire, and two very good questions. On the first one, as I touched on in my speech, we found this debate about the regional level one of the hardest, and we reflected on why, in a sense, the coalition government had felt able to do away with that regional tier. Now, part of the answer, I think, was that what we had created, the regional development agencies, for example, were seen as essentially arms of national government, rather than really locally driven, I think, fairly or unfairly. Secondly, there is a challenge here about where power lies, and in particular, the growth of the city regional areas and how they bumped up against the regional structures. So the first example, obviously, of Greater Manchester in the northwest, Birmingham in the West Midlands. So our first thought was that in order to avoid, if you like, reducing power away from cities and city regions, the combined authorities, we needed to look to models of regional governments that were probably bigger. And that's what I touched on with the 4 areas. I think too, and therefore that leads to a big question about whether you can have them directly elected. And I think on balance, we felt not. We thought the debate about adding another tier of government being reopened wouldn't be helpful. But we did see the need for something to happen at that level. Hence the idea of collaborations indirectly formed, i.e. drawn from the existing elected authorities in those regions. So in short, I think we decided that probably wouldn't be a terribly constructive direction to go in, and we would be better off looking at regional collaborations. If you do nothing, which would in a sense be the easy route, as I said, you effectively hand the job over to central government. Your second question was about equalisation of funding in sub-regional areas. And the short answer is we haven't looked at that in depth. I certainly think it's an area that I have looked at in the past and is worth exploring. And I think potentially has the power to bind those areas better together in what they do. So thank you for that.
Well, one of the criticisms of local government reform and devolution in England is that it's proceeded in a very ad hoc, piecemeal way based around individual deals with particular local actors. Do you think we need a programme for systematic devolution of power in England, or is this kind of piecemeal approach an adequate way of proceeding?
Short answer is I don't think it's adequate. And I touched on that a bit in my speech when I referred to the deal-based approach having run its course. I think, to be fair, the whole approach of deal-based devolution was developed by Greg Clark because he felt that if he took time to try and, if you like, define the destination of devolution, he'd be spending years on that and making no progress, and would come up against all the barriers to devolution that we know exist. So he decided in a way to go down this path. And arguably, with a powerful champion in George Osborne, there was a success in punching through in Greater Manchester. But I think as a model, it suffers from a number of barriers. Firstly, you end up with huge inconsistency. You're absolutely right. As I described it, a patchwork quilt. I think the second problem is it's hugely difficult for individual places to negotiate fundamental shifts in national policies. There have been some successes, but by and large, you kind of find the barriers are too great. And I think the third problem is that large parts of the country have been left out of the conversation. If you haven't been able to get a combined authority or a mayor or both, you've really not been at the table. And I think devolution should happen regardless of the governance structure in particular places. So I think it's run its course. It did advance the cause of devolution, but it didn't, in a sense, create a coherent framework, and crucially didn't address the issue of funding as well as powers. So I think we need a more comprehensive approach from government on devolution. And we've argued that in the report, and it's a strong personal view as well.
Okay. I'm going to now invite Tony Crook from Professor Tony Crook from Sheffield University to pose a question to you. It looks like a bit of a poser, this one, Bob. So over to you, Tony.
Bob, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah. Oh, say calling Bob from Kerber. Hello, Encliffe, as they say. Bob, more seriously, it's a question you and I have discussed before. So it's not a googly, as it were. I mean, when I was a grad student at the Bartlett, it was the time of the Southeast Study and all the grand regional projects. And looking back over my career, so we now know how long it is, regional policy has not largely been effective. Lots of ambitions, crushed for all sorts of reasons, and you and I know what those are. So my question is, and I'm not saying there's an answer which is negative, what makes you think that we can crack this problem now? And as a supplementary, which I didn't put in the note that John's seen, which is, does COVID-19 give us an opportunity to address these issues? You might say quite paradoxically, because my worry is we go back to business as usual, and you will have seen my note on that to the Commission. So looking back on it, to sum it up, why should we be more confident that after 70 years of ambition and relative failure, this might work?
Thank you, Tony. It's a good question. As you say, I have had it from you before, and it's a very fair one. And it's good to talk to you. We're not that far away, of course. I'm in Sheffield today, and you're in the Peak District. I think the question of why regional policy hadn't worked was one that exercised the Commission in quite a lot of its deliberations. And we did quite an analysis, which is in the first report, of the causes of failure, if you like, despite the good intentions. And particularly Ian Ray was very strong in his work on this. There are a number of reasons. I think one reason is that we've had fragmented policy. We've never had a comprehensive approach to the agenda of regional inequality. We've had individual initiatives that have kind of emerged, burnt brightly for a little while, and then gone. And that's, I suppose, the second point, is that we've been beset by frequent policy changes and structural changes. So we create the RDAs and then we abolish them and so on. And there's been no consistency in the approach, really. I think a third issue really is that deep down, I'm not sure that central government has wholly believed either in the need or the possibility of rebalancing. And I was in many conversations inside central government that led me to that view. It's only when you have a strong political leadership intent on doing it, does that barrier become overcome. But we do know that regional policy has worked in other parts of Europe, that this isn't mission impossible. So if it can be done elsewhere, what might change it in this country? And I think our first conclusion was that this needs a different approach from government that is cross-government, large-scale, long-term. The long-term bit is crucial in this. It is not susceptible to some micro-initiative that comes and goes. It has to be part of a wider and longer-term plan. I think the second point we make, a very simple one, if you like, is that it has to be properly resourced, and there has to be a consistency about policy decisions on investment. Because what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years is whatever funding has gone into regional inequality has been more than outweighed by the investment decisions that have driven money to the London and the South East, really. And I think the third point, really, that I would pick out here is the one around devolving power, that it's very hard to deliver this agenda if it's all driven from the centre and then susceptible to changes at central government level. So you might say, well, are the conditions for that to happen likely? And we can't, as a commission, say for certain about that. What we could describe is what we thought was necessary to succeed, and that's what we felt we did in the report, in the final report. It's for government now to, in a sense, either accept that argument or not. What is, I think, a powerful lever is that the current government was elected on an agenda of levelling. There's a political reason they've gone for it, of course, we all know this. But it does give us a point of leverage to drive, because they cannot, I think, go back to a future election and say, well, we know we told you we were going to commit to levelling up, but actually we've done next to nothing about it. That will be very damaging for them. And I think, therefore, we have something to work on here in terms of the debate. Where does coronavirus take it, Tony? It could go, I'd be blunt about it, in opposite directions. It could be that the sheer task of dealing with the emergency overwhelms government and very little else moves on. On the other hand, I think in the country, there is quite an appetite to say things have to be different from now on in a whole number of ways. And I think one of the ways we need to argue that they have to be different is that we cannot carry on with the scale of imbalances we have at the moment. So I do think COVID is both a risk and an opportunity. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, really, to ensure that, as I touched on in my speech, that when we come out of this terrible period, we genuinely build back better and we create a more equal and resilient country. It's going to be a political debate, and I honestly don't know yet which way it's going to go.
Okay. We have a question. Denise Leversley has what I think is an interesting question. Could we hear from Denise?
Hello. Sorry to take time to unmute. Thank you very much, Bob. I'm a statistician, and I'd like to ask your views on the adequacy of regional and local data to drive the sort of changes and the policies that you're proposing.
Again, something we spent a lot of time discussing, and the short answer is that they're not terribly adequate in a whole number of ways. To be fair, efforts have been made to improve the quality of regional data, so I think it's got better, but I don't think we either have sufficiently good data across a number of a wide enough range of things that we would want, data points, if you like, we'd want to measure, nor do we have a clear enough set of, if you like, agreed metrics that we're going to use to judge progress, I think. So I think there's a gap in both directions actually here. And indeed in our report, buried in the report, is a proposal really to do a lot more on both, really, both target setting and on the measurement. One of the encouraging things that came out early, governments, I think in the first budget actually, was a commitment to invest more funding in strengthening the quality of data, and it was a reasonably chunky sum of money actually. So I welcome that. I think I hope it can be harnessed and used well in order to sort of tackle the current deficiencies.
Okay, thank you for that, Denise. Could I ask Richard Wakeford? He has a question which kind of picks up on the topic we were discussing before Denise's question, but I think it's a key one.
Okay, well, I'm Richard Wakeford, and I have worked in planning policy in government and at the centre of government. And I had the great privilege of working with Michael Heseltine and Peter Hall, when Peter Hall effectively persuaded Michael Heseltine to move HS1 from the South Bank to the North Bank and almost serve Docklands. And I've also written a book about American planning, so I very much enjoyed the reference to Daniel Burnham. It was just such an inspiring approach for what planning should be about. But in terms of where I've been in government, both in Whitehall and at the centre of Whitehall in the Cabinet Office and in the Scottish Government, one of the things that I've learned is that you need political leadership. So I don't know whether we have politicians now at the UK level, or possibly even just at the England level, with the political leadership and vision likely to stay long enough in the post and able to earn respect in the Treasury and business departments to actually get on and deliver something, rather than being replaced by yet another Secretary of State who comes in with different ideas. And that was the gift of Michael Heseltine when he was Secretary of State for the Environment, and then again for Trade and Industry, and then working at the centre of the Cabinet Office. But I don't know whether we've got politicians today who are actually capable of inspiring government in its wider sense to deliver over the length of period that's necessary for plans to actually get delivered.
I have a lot of sympathy what you say there, and there's quite a lot of things I'd like to kind of respond on it. We have been plagued by chopping and changing. I think if I just take housing, the area I work in, I think there's been a housing minister for almost every year in the last 10 years, maybe more. And in those circumstances, it's hugely hard to get policy continuity. So I agree with that. I also agree that Michael Heseltine was an unusual beast in government in his breadth of vision and his kind of ability to get things moving and done and followed through. A massive amount of time for him. So what's the answer to this, really, given that we're not magically overnight going to change the uncertainties of our current political system? I think part of the answer is to look to other institutional structures that do have a specific brief that thinks long term. So, for example, we feel that the National Planning, the National Infrastructure Committee, is an example of something built and created to have a deliberately long-term perspective in what it does, and a level of permanency that can survive individual governments. And there may be other areas that merit that kind of approach, but we did particularly suggest, as I touched on in my speech, that the National Infrastructure Commission becomes the National Planning and Infrastructure Commission and takes on a role of doing the spatial plan. So one of the things I think is a response to this volatility in British politics is to try and create longer term institutions that are still subject to political accountability, but nevertheless have...
Sake.
Mute.
Is that on?
Sorry. I'm sorry about that.
Worries. I mean, we're all learning, aren't we? But sticking with this point. So I think, first of all, I do think creating institutional structures that have longevity are crucial. And I think this is also true, by the way, in climate change. I think the Climate Change Committee has been a powerful force as well here and can be built on. So that's the first point. I think the second point is whether, and this is a harder call, we can build a consensus across the political parties on the agenda of levelling up and the tasks needed that might survive changes in government. Again, there have been examples of that. I think on planning, which is a specific issue here, what would I say? Well, in truth, I touched on it. My heart sinks a little bit when I hear people suggesting we need another planning review, because almost invariably the reviews have very narrow kind of perspectives. They're almost always about why can't we speed it up? Why can't we get more certainty in the decisions? And not that those are things you should never think about, but there's rarely been, I think, the vision to think about the creative role of planning. And maybe if we could develop these national spatial plans and we could get a strengthening of the importance of spatial planning, that might just change. And the next review wouldn't be yet another review of what really is development control. So, I hear your pain, really, and your frustration about these issues in this country. And I guess I'd say nothing ever changes until it does, really. And I think our responsibility is to think through the ways in which we could get that greater capacity and consistency in national government. So the last point I'd make is, if we could just break through on devolution, you'd free up the capacity in central government. My experience in central government is it's overwhelmed by the detail of stuff that it deals with because it's so centralised. And maybe if we could get government to genuinely devolve, it would have the space to do the longer term thinking that often eludes it.
Okay, I'd like my colleague Professor Yvonne Ryden has a question. So if you can join in, Yvonne.
Yes, thanks very much, John. Thanks for a great speech. My question is about the economic model behind your arguments. And it seems like there are two models in there. One, which is sort of dominant one, is the idea of using all the resources of the country to kind of generate growth across the country and then to make sure that's redistributed back properly. But then you also talked about the sort of innovation at the locality level, which is a slightly different sort of approach. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how you would release that sort of innovation at the more local level.
I think you're right. We are working on both. And what we're arguing, I guess, in the first of those kind of points is that if we could raise kind of productivity and wealth creation outside of London and create a more balanced economy, the country as a whole would be more productive, really, and more effective, and that the imbalance at the moment creates an overheated London, if you like, and underpowered areas outside London and the South East. So you're quite right. That is one core economic argument that we're seeking to advance, that everybody wins if we can secure greater prosperity outside of London and the South East. And when you look at the comparative productivity levels, and I know productivity isn't everything, of some parts of the country, they are kind of shockingly low in comparison with our Northern European counterparts. So that, you're right. The second point about innovation is an important one, I think. What I would argue here is that the way we're in a period of what has been described by some as kind of radical uncertainty. That when I talk about national plans, I don't think you can produce directive plans that do everything at detailed level, nor should you try, really. They should create the conditions in which there can be local innovation and growth. And I think that can create economic benefit. More as important, though, is what you can try to do is to if you like, experiment at local level and then see what works and what doesn't, really, on policy. And we lack, I think, the capacity to do enough of that. And that is, if you like, an argument that says if we are going to succeed as a country, we have to get very good at innovation. But a lot of that innovation happens by freeing up local leadership to take the role on that. And just to be clear on that, I do think it works at different levels. So we need to have policies that work. I describe it as sometimes as Grimsby and graphene, really. We do need a distributed R&D, a better distributed R&D across the country, away from the Golden Triangle. So we need strong research and manufacturing of innovation, for example, like the AMRC in Sheffield. But we also need to have leadership strategies that have innovative approaches to making places that will never be high-end research, but nevertheless we need to see progress. So I think you're right, there are two models working here. I don't think they're in contradiction to each other. You need, in effect, to do both. You need to do conscious big-scale policies that will drive improvements in key things like skills and productivity and infrastructure, and you need to free up local places to innovate and be creative. And And actually what I've seen, having worked in local government, is that much of the, if you can allow places to innovate, they will, and they'll come up with better ideas than we're doing through our highly centralised approach at the moment.
Okay, there's a kind of a bit of a follow-up question really here from Kevin Richardson of Newcastle University. Kevin, do you want to put your question to Lord Kerslake?
Hi, Sir Bob. Kevin. Hi, Sir Bob. Kevin in Newcastle. Bob, you'll be aware that Rishi Sunak has proposed that the Treasury set up an economic campus somewhere in the north without specifying what it should do and how it should do it. What do you think it should do? And do you think it's a good idea?
Good question. Gosh, I did a review of the Treasury actually a few years back, and one of our proposals was that the Treasury should take capacity out of Whitehall and have more of a presence outside London. I'm slightly worried about the concept because A, it's quite ill-defined, as you suggest, Kevin, but also I wonder if it sort of suggests that the answer is simply about creating alternative capacity out of London, just one extra centre of capacity. And I'm not sure that is entirely the right answer. If it can be doing genuinely new and different things that are not being done by the Treasury at the moment, maybe that is worth thinking about. What I think, but if it's simply saying we'll put part of the Treasury outside London, I'm not sure that model has wholly worked in other departments, and indeed some of them have ended up going backwards rather than forwards. My preference, I think, is that the Treasury has a presence across the country. It doesn't have to be big numbers, but the Bank of England does have a regional presence, and I think that helps it get insights into how the economy is working that informs its thinking at national level. So I'm not absolutely against it. I'd like to see more of what it would involve. And I think probably of my preference would be not simply creating whole new chunks of the Treasury, but actually having a Treasury presence across the country really would be my preference.
There's quite an interesting debate going on, Bob, in the webinar chat about spatial planning and what are, how we achieve effective strategic planning. There's also two questions here from an anonymous attendee, so I can't invite that person to contribute. But I'll read them out because I think they pertain to the discussion going on in the webinar chat. What are the form and qualities of new spatial plans you'd like to see? How do you imagine the development of currently disconnected and economically non-self-sustaining towns? You've kind of touched on both of these questions, but this is an opportunity perhaps for you just to give us a few more reflections.
Yeah, just on the first point, really, I think what I would say is that what happened during the austerity period is local authorities were under huge financial pressure. And as a consequence, I think, they stripped back a lot of the planning capacity that was there above and beyond simply running the development control system. The ability to do spatial planning was cut back, if you like. And then alongside that, you had a local plan process that was was bluntly over-engineered and almost took far too long, and then was quite, as I said, litigious and mechanical in its processes. So I guess what I would say is what I would hope for is that we can build capacity back in our planning services to do more strategic planning. First point. Second point, that we can reform the way we do, particularly local plans, but more beyond that, to allow, create a more flexible, quicker and creative process. here that doesn't end up being such a legalistic and grinding exercise, really. Now, you might say that's, again, too ambitious, but again, other countries manage it. So I think restoring the value of that kind of spatial planning and being a more dynamic, inclusive, creative process is what I would hope for in the future. That's the first question I hope I've tried to answer, but it is going to be about both resources and changing the way the regime works, really, I think. Your second question was about disconnected towns. We did a lot of work on this in the Commission, and particularly Jim Steer did a really valuable analysis of which places were the most disconnected in terms of particularly their transport connectivity. So, and that's why we argued that we needed a connectivity revolution, the creation, if you like, of a new public transport network, particularly, that would achieve the connections between cities that we're seeking to achieve, that would significantly enhance the inter-sub-regional connectivity in sub-regions, and would develop the connectivity to those towns that wouldn't get covered by any of that, really, that need. And he has done a very useful analysis of the sort of investment you might undertake to do that. And we have published that. Indeed, Jim is doing some more work on modelling what that might mean. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that connectivity is the only issue that's needed, but I do think it's a crucial part of tackling the left behind places. And it goes back to my point that we need to focus on what some have called city systems, if you like, that look at all of those angles. So you definitely need plans for local investment in towns, but if those towns are deeply disconnected to the major economic centres, then I don't think whatever you do in the town will be enough, is my point. So you've got to work on both.
Right, we're moving towards the end, but there's a question here from Nicholas Falk, which is on a similar thing, but taking a slightly different take on it. So are you there, Nicholas?
Yes, thanks very much. I want to raise the question of resourcing, because I think plans without the capacity to implement them could be seen as a diversion. And the most obvious resource in the present and foreseeable future will be underused land and buildings, particularly in and around our town centres. So I'm wondering what stops us now experimenting with doing the sorts of things that are commonplace in Germany, France, and so on, and using the uplift in land values to help fund local infrastructure and to share the benefits more widely with the community. You might like to think about what happened after the Second World War and comprehensive development areas, and also new towns, which were used to mobilize underused land to get things done in a time of urgency.
Well, Nick, you know I'm very sympathetic, and indeed you did I think, a very good piece of work supporting the Commission on land value uplift and capture. And I think you're absolutely right to say there's enormous potential here to create the resources needed. I don't think it would be the only way you do it, but in a world, particularly given COVID, where government will be strapped for cash for some time to come, they're going to have to look at new models of raising income that work better than the current ones. And certainly, we don't. Our current land tax, our property taxes do not work effectively. Why has it not happened? Well, what would I say? I think it's the nervousness of politicians is the first thing, really. They're worried about the potential backlash to it. Perhaps if they were prepared to sanction local experiments, going back to the question I had earlier, that might be more manageable. Empower local places to do these things would be one way forward. I think the second reason why there's been little progress is that it goes into, it is part of, it's not a quick fix, is it? Nick. It's going to be a long game change. You have to, it's complexity, it will take time to develop. The resources come in over often reasonably long periods. And we are a country that has been in the grip of a very short-term approach. So it doesn't yield the quick results that often ministers and others yearn for. Now, that isn't to say it shouldn't happen. And maybe in this post-COVID world that we're going into, the choices will be so limited that it will force government to explore it and be willing to consider taking it further, if only in empowering local places. So I certainly haven't given up the ghost, and I'm very much supportive of your arguments on it.
Okay, probably going to make this the final question. Trevor Cherrett has a question about rural development. Trevor? You need to unmute your mic.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. I just wondered what you think, Bob, about how rural areas fit into all this. Going to be huge changes, and I'm not just talking about agriculture or environment or conservation, but rural economy, which is changing too, and which has been doing pretty well actually in past decades. So how do rural areas fit into the UK 2070 vision?
We did touch on that. I wouldn't claim that we gave it the in-depth analysis that we perhaps ought to have done, but we certainly touched on some of the challenges that rural areas face. I come back to what I mentioned earlier, really, which is I do think the biggest single challenge for rural areas is often the ability to be connected to other areas, really. The transport networks and the weakness of those networks is a massive challenge. And so I think a combination, if you could rebalance, you would have stronger economic centres close to rural areas than we have at the moment in some parts. And if you could reconnect places, then you would have that ability for that economic benefit to permeate more widely. I guess I'd probably put a third point in there, which is about those economic activities that can be created in rural spaces as well. And that goes back to my strong view about empowered local leadership, that if we could give more devolved power at local level, often very local level, then I think we could see some of the successes be more significant, really, at rural level. So I wouldn't claim we've done the full job on that. Others have worked on it to a much greater extent, but those would be my key thoughts on the rural area. And it's certainly something we're open to further conversation about. I would be honest and say that whilst I think it's absolutely right to, if you're genuinely interested in inclusive growth, to think about the rural areas, rebalancing will fundamentally happen through the urban areas, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, there's some outstanding questions, but they're all from anonymous attendees. So I can't sort of draw those people into the conversation, unfortunately, because I don't know who they are. So with that in mind, I think, and given the time, I'm going to draw proceedings to a conclusion. I think these are testing times, and I think it's incumbent upon those of us who work in universities, among other things, to provide a space for debates about how to build a fairer and more sustainable society as we emerge from the current crisis. We've heard just now, I think, a very valuable contribution to this end, and I'd like to thank Lord Kerslake for his lecture, for his thoughtful approach, and for his responses to all of the questions. On a personal note, I would also like to thank Bob for his chairing of the UK2070 Commission. I learned a lot from watching him go about his work with efficiency, grace, and rigour. So thank you once again to Bob. Normally at this point we ask for a round of applause. We can't do that, so thank you again. Thank you to all who've attended this evening. I'm sorry we couldn't all be together in one place, but hopefully we'll meet again some sunny day in Bloomsbury. Good night and go well.
Thank you.